A man was clinically dead for 11 minutes. No heartbeat, no brain activity. Flat line on every monitor. When he was resuscitated, he described in precise detail the specific conversations the medical staff had during those 11 minutes, the instruments they used, the exact words spoken by the surgeon. He had been unconscious. His brain had been generating no measurable electrical activity. There was no neurological mechanism by which he could have perceived anything. And yet, the account was verified by the staff who were present, by the surgical notes taken at the time. This is not an anecdote. This is a documented case from a peer-reviewed study involving over 2,000 cardiac arrest patients across 15 hospitals in the United Kingdom, United States, and Austria. The study was called AWARE. It was led by Dr. Sam Parnia at Southampton University, and its findings have never been fully explained by conventional neuroscience. That was your 60 seconds. Now we go deeper, because this case is not the strange one. It is one of thousands. And the pattern across all of them is what makes dismissal increasingly difficult. To understand why this matters, we first need to understand what neuroscience currently believes about consciousness, because the dominant model has a problem it cannot solve. The dominant model is called physicalism, the idea that consciousness is produced by the brain, that thoughts, experiences, memories, and subjective awareness are the output of neural activity, nothing more. This model is reasonable. It is supported by enormous amounts of evidence. Damage the brain and you change the personality. Alter the brain chemistry and you alter the mood. The correlation between brain states and conscious experience is real and measurable. But correlation is not the same as causation, and the physicalist model has a gap at its center that philosophers of mind call the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem, articulated by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995, is this. We can explain what the brain does. We cannot explain why doing it feels like anything. Why does processing visual information feel like seeing red? Why does the neural firing associated with pain feel like pain rather than just being a signal? Why is there something it is like to be you? No physical process we know of generates subjective experience. A computer processes information. It does not feel like anything to be that computer. Why does it feel like something to be you? This is not a question neuroscience has answered. It is a question neuroscience has not yet been able to properly frame. In that gap, between neural activity and felt experience, is where the near-death research becomes scientifically interesting, because near-death experiences don't just involve reports of floating above the body. They involve verifiable perceptions, specific, checkable, documented facts perceived during periods of confirmed unconsciousness. The AWARE study was specifically designed to test this. Researchers placed images on shelves in cardiac resuscitation rooms, images visible only from above, only from a position near the ceiling. The hypothesis was simple. If patients reported floating above their bodies during resuscitation and could correctly identify those images, it would constitute objective evidence of perception outside the body during unconsciousness. Of the 2,060 patients enrolled, 330 survived to be interviewed. 140 recalled some level of awareness during resuscitation, and one verified case correctly described the visual and auditory environment during confirmed cardiac arrest. One case is not proof. Parnia himself said this clearly. But one verified case, in a controlled study, is enough to make dismissal scientifically unjustifiable, because conventional neuroscience has no mechanism for explaining it, and a single genuine anomaly is enough to indicate that the model is incomplete. But AWARE is not alone. The Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel conducted his own prospective study of 344 cardiac arrest patients across 10 hospitals. Published in the Lancet in 2001, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, his findings were equally difficult to explain away. 18% of his patients reported near-death experiences, 12% reported deep experiences including out-of-body perception, and critically, the experiences showed no correlation with medication, brain damage, or psychological factors. Van Lommel concluded that consciousness cannot be located exclusively in the brain. His words, in the Lancet in 2001. Now let's examine the skeptical position, because it deserves more than dismissal. The skeptical explanations for near-death experiences are serious and scientifically grounded. Hypothesis 1. Oxygen deprivation. The brain under hypoxia generates hallucinations. The tunnel of light, the sense of peace, the out-of-body sensation, all consistent with the visual cortex misfiring under oxygen stress. This is a solid hypothesis, but it has a problem. Hallucinations under hypoxia are typically fragmented, incoherent, and poorly remembered. Near-death experiences are typically the opposite. Coherent, structured, and remembered with unusual clarity for decades. Hypothesis 2. REM intrusion, the dreaming state bleeding into waking consciousness during the transition of cardiac arrest, producing vivid, emotionally intense experiences. Again, plausible. But REM intrusion occurs during the process of losing or regaining consciousness, not during confirmed flatline brain states. The verified accounts happen during confirmed absence of brain activity. Not before, not after, during. Hypothesis 3. Memories formed during brief moments of partial consciousness that the patient doesn't remember as partial. The brain flickering on for seconds, perceiving, then going dark again. This is the most scientifically defensible skeptical position, and it might explain many cases, but it cannot explain cases where patients reported accurate perceptions from locations like above the operating table, where partial sensory awareness would still not provide that visual angle. The skeptical explanations are not wrong. They are incomplete. They explain some features of the phenomenon. They don't explain all of it. And in science, an explanation that doesn't cover all the data is a partial explanation, not a closed case. Now let's go to the physics, because this is where the conversation shifts from medicine to something more fundamental. In 1989, mathematician and physicist Roger Penrose published The Emperor's New Mind. It argued that consciousness cannot be the product of classical computation, that something non-algorithmic must be involved. His argument was rooted in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, mathematical proofs that any formal system capable of arithmetic contains truths that cannot be derived from its own axioms. Truths a computer could not reach but a mind can recognize. Penrose proposed that whatever generates consciousness operates at the quantum level, not the classical neural level. And in 1994, he collaborated with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff to develop a specific mechanism. They called it orchestrated objective reduction, ORC-OR, the proposal that quantum computations occur inside microtubules, protein structures within neurons, and that the collapse of quantum superposition in those structures generates moments of conscious experience. The theory was widely dismissed when proposed. Critics argued that the brain is too warm and wet for quantum coherence to survive. That decoherence would destroy any quantum state before it could do useful work. But in 2014, quantum coherence was demonstrated in biological systems, specifically in photosynthesis. Plants were shown to use quantum effects to transfer energy with efficiency that classical physics cannot explain. The warm-wet environment argument, the main objection to ORC-OR mode, had just been invalidated by photosynthesis. The biology was already doing quantum computing. We just hadn't looked closely enough. In 2022, a team at the University of Surrey published evidence of quantum vibrations in microtubules in living brain tissue, exactly where Penrose and Hameroff had predicted they would be. ORC-OR is not proven, but it has moved from fringe speculation to active research program with empirical support. The dismissals have become harder to sustain. Now consider what ORC-OR implies about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. If consciousness arises from quantum processes, it is connected to the fundamental structure of reality in a way that classical neuroscience never considered. And quantum processes, as we have established in other contexts, do not respect the boundaries of space and time in the way classical physics does. Hameroff himself has argued that under ORC-OR, the quantum information that constitutes consciousness does not simply disappear at death, that it may dissipate into the fundamental quantum substrate of space-time itself. He is careful to say this is speculative, but he is a serious scientist making a serious claim in a serious research context. And the claim is this: consciousness may be a fundamental feature of the universe, not a product of the brain. This is called panpsychism, or more specifically, in modern philosophy of mind, cosmopsychism. The idea that consciousness is not generated by complex systems but is a property of the universe itself that complex systems tap into. This is not a new idea. It is ancient, but it is now being articulated in the language of physics and neuroscience. And it is being taken seriously by people who built careers on dismissing it. Christoph Koch, former chief scientific officer of the Allen Institute for Brain Science, spent decades as a committed physicalist. In recent years, he has publicly moved toward integrated information theory, a framework that assigns consciousness as a fundamental property of information processing systems at all scales, not just brains, any sufficiently integrated information processing system. The implication, which Koch acknowledges, is that consciousness may be far more widespread in nature than neuroscience has assumed. Now let's return to the near-death data, because there is a feature of these experiences that the mechanistic explanations struggle with most, and it has nothing to do with verifiable perception. It is the consistency, across cultures, across centuries, across religious backgrounds, and none. The core features of near-death experiences appear with extraordinary regularity in people who have never encountered each other's accounts. The sense of leaving the body, the movement through darkness toward light, the encounter with deceased relatives. The life review, a panoramic, non-judgmental replay of significant life experiences. The sense of a boundary that cannot be crossed. In the aftermath, which is perhaps the most clinically documented and consistently reproducible aspect of the entire phenomenon. People who have near-death experiences show measurable, lasting changes in personality and values. Reduction in fear of death, not just philosophically but neurologically, as measured by stress response testing. Increased empathy, reduced materialism, altered relationship with time. These changes persist for decades. They are not consistent with a traumatic hallucination. They are consistent with an experience that restructured the person's fundamental framework for reality. The psychiatrist Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia has spent over 40 years studying this phenomenon. His conclusion is not that near-death experiences prove life after death. It is that they prove our current model of the relationship between brain and consciousness is inadequate. Those are different claims, and the distinction matters enormously. We do not need to invoke the supernatural to take this data seriously. We need only to acknowledge that the physical model of consciousness is incomplete, and that incomplete models generate anomalies, and that anomalies are where science advances. Consider what we know about the brain that doesn't fit the standard model. Phineas Gage, the railway worker who had a tamping iron driven through his frontal lobe in 1848 and survived with a transformed personality. His case is cited as evidence that the brain generates personality, but consider also the documented cases of hydranencephaly, children born with almost no cerebral cortex, just a brainstem filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Some of these children laugh, respond to music, and show clear signs of emotional experience, with almost none of the neural architecture that physicalism requires for conscious experience. And yet, by behavioral evidence, something is there. John Lorber, the Sheffield neurologist who studied this phenomenon, asked a question that has never been adequately answered. Is your brain really necessary? He was not claiming the brain is irrelevant. He was pointing at the evidence that the relationship between neural tissue and consciousness is far less straightforward than the standard model assumes. Now let's go to something that the standard model has not yet addressed at all: terminal lucidity. Terminal lucidity is a phenomenon documented in medical literature since the 18th century. Patients with severe neurological conditions, advanced Alzheimer's, brain tumors, meningitis, who have not spoken or shown signs of recognition for months or years, suddenly, in the hours or days before death, regain full clarity of consciousness. They recognize family members. They have coherent conversations. They express things they could not have expressed in years, and then they die. The brain that produced this lucidity is, by every imaging and clinical measure, severely damaged. The neural substrate for the consciousness being expressed should not be there. In many cases, it measurably isn't. Alexander Battiani at the University of Vienna has collected over 80 cases of terminal lucidity with rigorous documentation. He describes it as one of the most scientifically challenging phenomena in all of medicine. Because if the brain generates consciousness, and the brain is severely compromised, the consciousness should be compromised. In terminal lucidity, it is not. It is, by all reports, heightened. The physicalist model predicts the opposite of what is observed. That is not a small problem. That is the kind of data point that in any other field would force a revision of the model. Now, what do we do with all of this? Because this is not a video about faith. It is not a video about what happens after death. It is a video about what the evidence forces us to consider about what consciousness is. Option 1. Consciousness is entirely produced by the brain. All the anomalies, near-death perception, terminal lucidity, hydranencephaly cases, have conventional explanations we haven't found yet. The model is correct. The data is incomplete. Option 2. Consciousness is produced by the brain, but the relationship is more complex than the standard model captures. The brain may be a receiver as well as a generator, filtering and expressing a consciousness that has a substrate we haven't identified yet. Option 3. Consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality that the brain interacts with but does not produce. the way a television interacts with electromagnetic signals without generating them. All three options are consistent with some of the data. None of them is consistent with all of it, which means the honest position is that we don't know. And not knowing is not a comfortable place to be, but it is the only intellectually honest place available given the current state of the evidence. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, not a religious thinker, wrote in 2012 that the materialist, neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. Not because of religion, because of consciousness. Because no version of materialism we currently have explains how subjective experience arises from physical processes. And that gap, that single unexplained gap, is large enough to contain an entirely different picture of what we are. Sam Parnia continues his research. He is currently running AWARE 2, a larger, better-designed version of the original study with more sophisticated hidden targets and more rigorous verification protocols. The results are not yet published in full, but Parnia has said publicly that the data continues to challenge the assumption that the brain is the sole generator of consciousness. We are at the beginning of this investigation, not the end. The hard problem of consciousness is still hard. The near-death data is still anomalous. The quantum biology findings are still being processed. But the question, what is consciousness and where does it live, is no longer a question that serious science can afford to leave to philosophy alone, because the experiments have started producing data, and the data doesn't fit neatly into the boxes we built for it. There was a man who was dead for 11 minutes, and when he came back, he knew things he couldn't have known. That single fact doesn't prove anything, but it points at something. And what it points at is the possibility that the most important question in science, what are we, really, remains genuinely open. Not answered by religion. Not answered by neuroscience. Still open. Still being asked. By the people who came back. And by the scientists who cannot explain what they brought with them.